You are watching George Schlacek.
The one and only.
Welcome to another episode of Bicycle Touring Talk. This series is based on my book, Destinations Are Fake. There's a link in the description. It follows the adventure of my first major bicycle tour. In episode 22, I told you about a decision I kept putting off. Was I going to spend the next 4 months just bumming around Mexico and live from one day to the next? Or was I going to try for a new experience becoming an English teacher in the city of Veracruz for a while? It was Monday morning and I was riding my bike again, fighting a strong headwind. I had finally decided that I was going back to Veracruz. The rain had tapered off, but occasional showers kept me wet despite some periods of picture-perfect sunshine. There was plenty of time to get back into town, find a hotel within walking distance of the language school and drop in there for the afternoon. My mind was made up. I was going to start a new adventure. It would give me time to get to know Veracruz better, and I felt that I had a good shot at gaining some experience as a teacher and meet new friends. I had never worked as a teacher before, so there was no guarantee this was going to happen. But what did I have to lose? Even a good, honest effort at a short and challenging career, teaching career, would certainly mean a personal gain. Later that day, I walked through the door at Kiosk International and was greeted by a young lady.
Who were you talking to the last time you were here?
She wanted to know. I'm not even sure what his name was, I responded. But before she could ask me anything else, the young man who had told me to come back appeared behind her.
Jorge is my name,
He said.
Please sit down. I will tell Lucy that you're here.
I waited patiently for about 15 minutes or so when a young lady with glasses showed up in front of me and introduced herself as
Lucy, I am the coordinator. Jorge told me about you. Let's go to my office and have a chat.
I followed her into a tiny office that had a huge bookshelf on one side, packed with language books, dictionaries, and other learning materials.
Tell me about yourself.
She started the conversation. I rattled down my story, starting with the course I had taken to prepare me for teaching English as a second language, months earlier. Then I went on about my bike tour and my first experiences in Mexico, finally ending by telling her how I had discovered the language school by accident. I would like to give this a shot. This place made a huge impression on me last week. Here I am applying to you for a teaching position. Her look was encouraging.
We actually do need a few teachers. Can you come back on the 4th of January in the morning?
There we go again, was my first thought. The date was December 21st, 2009. I had already decided and wasn't about to give up on the teaching opportunity now. But there was still no guarantee of employment and perhaps not even a very good chance. I already knew that nothing was going to keep me from appearing at this place again on the requested date. In the meantime, I had 2 weeks to do whatever I wanted, and I had full of ideas. I did not stay in Veracruz the next day. 2 weeks was all I had for some inland exploring, and I had a rough idea of what I wanted to see. I still had the must-see list, the friendly Mexican couple at the hotel near Nautla, you might remember that, had given me. The next 2 weeks would give me a chance to check out at least some of them. To start off, however, I wanted to ride to Córdoba, a town I had heard about on the Spanish language TV. The trip started off awkward. It had been fairly easy to follow the coast so far, but now I was looking for the best road to Córdoba. Could it be the toll highway, or should I take the free route? Still unsure about toll roads, I decided to follow the scenic route, which led to problems right off the bat. I had not been overly fussy about following a specific route since my arrival in Mexico, but I had followed a main highway in a general direction. This was why I was unprepared for the poor signage. I was trying to follow a highway now too, looking for signs to confirm my direction, but all the while believing to be on the right path to Córdoba. When I finally realized that I was way off track, it was too late. I would have lost almost the entire day, so I decided to adapt my tour and go toward Jalapa first. I would go on a big circle tour and visit Córdoba on the way back. Problem solved. Soon it became evident that there was something else I wasn't prepared for. During my entire tour up to my arrival in Veracruz, I had not climbed a real hill. Sure, there had been a few around Papantla, and yes, I had used my lowest gear and even pushed the bike on a couple of occasions. Now I was finding out what it felt like to climb long hills. Not only did I have to use my lowest gear, it was also taking all the energy right out of me. In order to keep moving at all, I had to have a strategy. Never look too far ahead. By looking down on the road, at least I had the illusion of rapid movement, which is way more motivating than an apparent standstill while you're killing yourself pedaling. There's one upside to climbing hills though. You gain elevation and eventually you have to come back down. Of course, compared to the long and grueling climb, the pleasure lasts merely a few minutes. But there's no better feeling than to descend a hill with a loaded bicycle. The weight makes you gain speed without effort. Make sure your brakes are in top working order. On this first day of my mini tour, the descent led me into a valley and a beautiful little town by the name of Paso de Ovejas. It was still relatively early in the day, but I decided to stop there and enjoy the small town atmosphere along with some good local food. I had no trouble finding a hotel, better and even cheaper than anything available in the city. Then I spent the rest of the afternoon doing what I love to do, wandering around, taking photographs and finally eating a huge supper at a busy local restaurant. Later, I discovered that my hotel even had Wi-Fi. I stayed up late, checked out whatever I could about Jalapa, the capital of Veracruz. The next day was once again nothing but a steady climb. I had figured that it would be a relatively quick trek to Jalapa, but my legs got tired early on and the entire day felt much like riding on a stationary bike. To top it off, it was a hot day, probably amounting to one of the toughest days of my journey so far. Not only was I constantly climbing, but the road was pretty boring too. Besides struggling up ever longer and steeper hills, I remember stopping at a place where I could take a break while leaning my bike against a guardrail. I had a quick snack and peed in the ditch. The little breather was cut short when I noticed that I had stepped into an anthill and had come under attack by thousands of aggravated little buggers. When I finally reached Jalapa as darkness was setting in, I was exhausted, hungry, and lost. It was not too hard to find a hotel, but the first few that I saw were simply out of my price range. A somewhat familiar problem. I was in the wrong part of town. But after some searching and pushing the bike along sidewalks, I finally found what I was looking for. An inexpensive, older hotel. Even though the price was still double what I had paid the night before, I booked 2 nights. It meant that I was going to stay in Jalapa till Christmas morning. For 2 days I did a lot of walking around, just like I had done in every other Mexican city I had visited so far. Contrary to popular North American beliefs, Mexican cities had turned out surprisingly safe and visitor-friendly. Besides exploring Jalapa, I did one more pivotal thing. On Christmas Eve, I went to an internet cafe and I booked a flight from Cancun to Orlando. See, up until this point, my return to Canada had been uncertain. While I did have a return ticket for a flight from Orlando back to Buffalo on April the 16th, the deciding question had been if and how I was going to make it back to Orlando by that date. When I found an extremely cheap flight out of Cancun for April the 15th, my problem was solved. My tour had just become a whole lot more defined. I was going to stay in Mexico. I was eventually going to continue on all the way around the Gulf of Mexico. It would keep me in the eastern part of Mexico, with some variations here and there as time would allow. I would have to leave Veracruz about a month before the flight, just to avoid a big rush toward the end that could potentially take the fun out of the experience. I went to bed happy that night. My return to Canada was now secured without having to backtrack all across northern Mexico. But it was also still 3.5 months away. Christmas Day started out cloudy with a lot of moisture in the air. I had decided to continue my trek toward a town by the name Perote. On the map it looked like a relatively short trip, but I still had no real concept of hills. This day was going to change that for good. The ride started out smoothly up to Banderilla, a suburb of Jalapa. I passed a couple of hotels that looked perfect for spending a night, but it just wasn't the right place nor the right time, or so I thought. I left the suburb energized by 2 days of rest and the prospect of exploring more interesting places. Barely noticeable at first, conditions changed ever so gradually for the worse. First, the clouds thickened and turned into dense fog. Then it got colder. I was also still climbing hill after hill, telling myself that a long descent could not be too far off. Of course, it was in part the increased elevation that led to the change in climate, but I was inexperienced in that regard. What kept me going steady was the firm belief that I would get rewarded for my hard work with a long descent sometime that day. No, I had not checked the map for altitudes, which would have seemed like Chinese to me anyways. How much worse than the ride to Jalapa could this possibly get? After nearly reaching a state of complete exhaustion, soaked all the way through from the fog that had evolved into a steady drizzle by then, I eventually reached a roadside food stand. The older lady who was running the place shook her head when she saw me. Where was I trying to go? She wanted to know.
Perote?
Well, that was going to take me many hours of it by bike. It was an hour or so by car, but on a bike, it would just be brutal. I would have more hills to climb, and yes, they were pretty steep. This simply wasn't the day, and it was way too wet. I bought a sandwich as this was pretty much the only quick item on the menu. While I was sitting down to eat, I was contemplating my next move. Perhaps this really wasn't the best day to ride to Perote. Maybe I had started too late or planned too long a ride without considering the altitude. I thought about turning back and how it would mean that I had muscled my way up all those hills basically for nothing. What was I gonna do? Finally, I asked the lady, who was now smiling at me, how much time she thought it would take to get to Perote riding my bike. She replied that it would take about 3 hours on a good day, but that today wasn't a good day. I thought about it for a while as I sat there shivering. As if she had read my mind, she finally said that I could make it back to Banderia in about 20 minutes. I thought of the hotel I had passed earlier. The idea seemed inviting, not only because I would finally get out of the rain, but also because I would get my long-awaited descent down those hills. It had taken me a few hours to get where I was, all morning. Going back down would mean that I would have to repeat the brutal climb again if I wanted to stick to my route. But for now, I'd be able to hammer down into town at breakneck speed. Under the circumstances and after thinking about it for a few moments, this was a no-brainer. I turned the bike around and started the descent, looking at my watch just for the fun of it. Barely 15 minutes later, I was in front of the hotel in Banderia. Never before had I experienced such a speed on a bike. The only thing that had slowed me down a bit was the wet weather. The downside was that I was shivering even more than before, probably from hypothermia. After checking into the hotel, I took a shower that lasted exactly as long as the hot water supply. Not very long. It wasn't enough to warm me up, but it helped enough to get me motivated to leave the room for one last time that day. I walked to a nearby store where I ended up buying some cheap tequila. If this wasn't going to get me warm and fuzzy, then nothing else would. When I returned to my room, I got comfortable in bed, found a movie channel on TV, and got plastered on the nasty liquid that probably wouldn't be approved for consumption anywhere but Mexico. Finally, I passed out for the night. I woke up late the next morning feeling drained, partially due to a bad hangover, but also from exhaustion. The weather outside was gray and wet. There was no way I was going up those hills again anyways right away. So I decided to take a true rest day and stayed in bed, eating whatever I could find in my panniers and watching some more movies. I didn't even peek outside until later in the afternoon. That's when sunshine was finally back. My hunger had started to bother me, so I decided to go outside and find a good place to eat downtown Banderia. I found a promising looking restaurant. After passing several people selling food on the sidewalk, thinking that I was going to treat myself to something special that day, which was actually Christmas Day, I took a seat in the restaurant. After a long wait, it turned out that the food was more expensive than I was used to, but mediocre at best. Perhaps it was best to support small food vendors outside after all. Since it was nice outside now, I spent the rest of the afternoon wandering around town in slow motion. Much later, I had a couple of quesadillas for supper, the kind you get in the street from Mom and Pop. Usually always great, and this time was no exception. It was just after dark when I returned to the hotel. My determination to ride into Perote the next day was now stronger than ever. I would have to get up early the next morning and tackle those painful long hills once again. But there was no way around it. I was going to get there. Well, how was this going to continue? Was I ever going to reach Perrote? What else would expect me down the road? I was getting further away from Veracruz into a mountainous region of Mexico and perhaps a different state. Puebla. I will tell you about it in my next episode, to be found here in about a week from now. Please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. It is nothing but a click and you won't miss my next video. If you'd like to know how I first got started bicycle touring, watch this series from the beginning. You may not make it through because the urge for touring will grow intolerable. See you next time.